Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. The death of the author is a commonly cited literary technique wherein a story is analyzed without any consideration of the author's intention, their life, the culture they come from, or the tradition in which they worked. Like all methods of literary analysis, the death of the author has a lot of useful applications, but it also has a lot of pitfalls. What makes it so useful is that it helps us highlight the thing that makes art so powerful, its connection to human universals. If you can go into any story and pull out those shadows of other concepts, even ones that the author may not have been actively thinking about, and show how they are nevertheless a part of this story, you can do a lot of good work. Something like Dante's Divine Comedy was written as a satire of Italian politics of Dante Alighieri's time. However, this satire is wrapped in the trappings of a journey through hell, purgatory, and ultimately heaven. As a part of this, Dante has a lot of opportunities to comment not only on the politics of his day, but the moral philosophy that underpinned his point of view, and with the trappings of his religious time period wrapped around it, there are very rich veins of meaning that go beyond just the political satire that Dante was making, which is one of the reasons why it remains an evergreen piece of literature. So in this respect, we see that the death of the author is very relevant to the continued reading of this piece of literature, from the strict one-to-one comparisons that Dante was trying to make over the course of his writing. At the same time, it frees us from Dante's intent. Dante had a lot of very clear opinions on what was happening in Italy of his time. And he was very free about taking people whose actions he liked in the political sphere and putting them in heaven, and the people whose actions he didn't like and putting them in hell. It was something he did, like quite a lot. But the fact that Dante wrote his piece that way does not mean that we have to interpret it that way. I'm not enough of a classical Italian scholar to tell you if there were any other poets who rebutted Dante's points in his story by reanalyzing his work through a different lens. But I can tell you of one instance where something similar has happened in the modern day. Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers was intended as a parable about the importance of being invested in the government of a nation before you were given any rights to help control that nation. However, the filmmaker, Paul Verhoeven, used the death of the author to completely transform that work when he adapted it into a movie, creating a film that is more about the use of violence to uphold a political order, and, in Verhoeven's own opinion, fascism, than it is about duty and responsibility. Starship Troopers is actually a very interesting lens to examine the death of the author through because it's also been questioned how effective Verhoeven was in really portraying his fascist dystopia of military power. The text does not always seem to support this point of view. However, the fact that both of these works of art can exist and have similarities in story structure and character arcs, and yet still have completely different intentions behind them, is in and of itself a bit of an affirmation of the importance of death of the author when looking at a work. We wouldn't have these two works to study and compare unless we were willing to put aside the intentions of the creators. At the same time, there are limits to the death of the author. Fully understanding what Dante is trying to say in the Inferno, to use one example, requires some familiarity with his time period, the points he was trying to make, the characters who were part of Italian politics that he was either criticizing or praising. Without that context, it's very hard to understand everything that he was trying to say. In fact, without some of the basic cultural context, there are even idioms that won't make any sense. I believe I've mentioned before on this channel that there is a section where Dante talks about one of the residents of the Inferno raising his hands to heaven and making figs, which is essentially a vulgar gesture, roughly the equivalent of throwing someone the finger. The person is then torn apart by the demons around him, and he returns to his torment in hell. Fully grasping what's going on there, that he had basically just flipped off God and been punished for it, is hard to do if you don't understand that making figs is a vulgar gesture. When I first read that passage, I thought he had somehow gotten a hold of food he wasn't supposed to have. And it was only later when I read a footnote that explained to me this particular piece of cultural context that I saw what it was actually saying. Finally, and perhaps most importantly for this channel and this video, if you disregard the intentions of the creator while you are attempting to analyze something, you cannot then examine how effective that creator was in getting their stated point across. Keep in mind, for the purposes of this channel, a story is a sequence of events conveyed from a storyteller to an audience in such a way that the audience can then repeat the story to someone else. While the death of the author is a very excellent analytical tool to pick out the themes and concepts and elements that resonate universally and apply to a wide variety of contexts, it is a very poor analytical tool for understanding the process by which a storyteller conveys their story to their audience. That is the issue that I am most invested in when I talk about storytelling. So I am very rarely going to utilize the death of the author as a tool when I analyze a story. I may not always know what the creator's intentions were with a scene or a line or a character arc or what have you, but when I do, it is very important for me to consider while I am analyzing that story, because it helps me understand the techniques and the methods they used to convey that story or that element of the story. Now, the death of the author still plays a small role in that. I don't assume that just because the author intended to do something with a story, they succeeded in doing something with a story. Like I said, whether or not Verhoeven successfully put his own political vision onto Robert Heinlein's story is open to interpretation. And you would have to go through the text, and you would have to pull out these parts, and you would have to support or disprove that argument using contrasting bodies of text compared to the ideologies that the two men espoused. So in that respect, while I don't consider the author dead, I am author skeptical, let's say. I do ask myself the question, did the author succeed in doing what they set out to do? But as someone who is interested in understanding storytelling and improving my sense of storytelling, I still have to start with the question, what was the author trying to do? If you don't know, I mean, you don't know. You just kind of have to go on what you know about storytelling in general and maybe common themes in an author's body of work. But when you have statements from a creator about the story they are trying to tell, and you're trying to analyze that story to determine whether it conveys that or not, then you are going to get results a lot more valuable than if you just analyze the story from the text and try and figure out what is working or what is not. Considering the author's intentions will highlight their successes and their failures with more clarity than the opposite. Okay, that was a much longer introduction than I thought it was going to be, but it is kind of just an introduction to a question, so maybe that's for the best. See, I am a longtime watcher of the podcast Every Frame a Pause. The most recent episode came out and began with some discussion of a TV show called The Boys. You may have heard of it. It's on Amazon Prime, and I've never watched it because I don't subscribe to any of those services because subscriptions are not something I'm a huge fan of, especially ongoing subscriptions where you basically just get free access to a body of content. Like, I subscribe to Anvil Magazine on a yearly basis because I know I'm going to get 4 magazines, and then I will have those magazines forever and ever. Whereas if I subscribe to Amazon Prime, well, I basically get free shipping and temporary access to a bunch of streaming shows and movies that aren't even guaranteed to be there. I'm not even like this massive physical media junkie. I just don't see that as something worth paying money over time for. Just like I never saw WoW as something worth paying money over time for. This isn't about subscriptions, forgive me. My point is, I don't know anything about The Boys. I kind of tuned out for that section. It wasn't super interesting to me. But I kind of listened with half an ear and got a sense of what they were talking about. And then a little while later, the almighty algorithm recommended me this video by a guy who calls himself Mustached Tom. You see him right here. I don't know why his face is so comically large, but it is. Anyway, he called out EFAP because EFAP is a big advocate of death of the author. Yet at the beginning of their most recent podcast, they read an interview with the creator of The Boys. In fact, most of that podcast was about interviews with creators. That's neither here nor there. But Tom's point was that they were not looking at The Boys through the death of the author. They were not just analyzing the text. They were also commenting on the creator's approach to creating that text. And it's very interesting because Tom had a very different take on the text than the creator did. The creator described a particular scene as a joke, where Tom found it to be a very serious and meaningful scene, and he thought it was hypocritical not to analyze the scene on its own merits rather than the merits of the work as a whole. And furthermore, he stated that if you looked at the work from a larger point of view, you would see that the story is one that is criticizing the main character's attitudes through the way it characterizes his decisions and the consequences of those decisions, which are, by all accounts, pretty gross. EFAP, on the other hand, and Mahler, the main host in particular, seem to characterize the author's statements about this scene as very hypocritical when contrasted against their comments about a similar scene in the first season that involved a woman rather than a man. In short, that the creator was being hypocritical in the way they characterized the scenes they had written. And if that sounds super vague, again, I don't know anything about The Boys. I'm not interested in watching it, and I certainly don't intend to do a review of it on here. I think I have better things to do with my time and money. But these are both interesting lines of discussion, at least to me. Because for me, I see that yes, you can have a well-constructed scene that is very gross and in fact is played in a very different way from a previous scene if the point of the scene in the text is to set up different lines of character development. So from that point of view, I can see where Death of the Author would help you investigate these character lines without considering other things that the author or showrunner, in this case, have said about the story. You can learn a little bit about the construction of a character arc or a narrative through line. That is an interesting and useful piece of analysis to consider as you struggle with the art of storytelling. But I don't think it's as useful as breaking down the various narrative techniques that a creator uses to convey their intentions to the audience. So if your goal, as Tom says his goal was, and as he claims EFAP's goal is to improve the art of storytelling by analyzing it, I think that the death of the author is actually misapplied in this context. On the flip side of the coin, EFAP did not really analyze the story at all. They were basically just dunking on the showrunner for being a hypocrite, which is, not terrible. That's certainly its own kind of entertainment. And it was not the main thrust of the discussion. This was really just something they talked about as they were waiting for people to file into the live stream. And there's a lot of this kind of thing that is done kind of lighthearted without the same level of in-depth analysis that they get into in some of their other things. So yeah, as a aid to creators trying to understand stories, it wasn't super useful. It was, again, just sort of a dunk on a showrunner of a show that most of the hosts have not been watching since season 2. So, an interesting tidbit to be sure, and one that is certainly relevant to their general line of discourse, which is entertainment and how it's made, with a specific eye towards the writing. And, everyone likes pointing and laughing at a hypocrite because it makes us feel a little bit better about our hypocrisies. But all in all, not something I would consider typically useful in thinking about how I would construct a story either. So, there you have it. Some broad thoughts on the death of the author, and some specific thoughts on the situation that brought the topic to the front of my mind most recently. If you're really interested in all of this back and forth and the discussion on The Boys, I've linked to the EFAP episode and Mustached Tom's videos. There may be something down there that you find interesting. Like I said, they're mostly discussing interviews with creators. And as a writer, I found some of what they had to say there pretty interesting. And a lot of it was funny, but not super useful when you're thinking about how to write a story. Likewise, Mustache Tom is responding specifically to their criticism of The Boys, and if you're not super invested in that show, I don't know how interesting that will be to you, but I certainly found the thoughts about the death of the author to be worthwhile. So even I, who don't have any interest in the show at all, got something out of it. In conclusion, when you're thinking about telling a story, use tools that help you think about telling the story. The death of the author is not one of those tools. It's just a tool to figure out what is in a story. That and the telling of a story are two very different things. At least that's what I think about it. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.